Hello, I'm Richard Murphy, and I'm creating a series of videos about what I think the tax justice movement should be thinking about in 2021. It's been going for 18 years now, and it's had an enormous range of successes. Country by country reporting, automatic information exchange, beneficial ownership disclosure, the change of culture around tax havens, the requirement that large companies now understand that they be accountable for the tax that they pay. These are all massive successes, but there's still a long way to go on many issues. And one of those issues that I think that the Tax Justice Network and many other organisations within the tax justice movement do not understand is the nature of the tax gap. Now, the tax gap is an issue which I've spent quite a lot of time talking about and which I think is really important. The tax gap actually is made up of 5 components that explain why a government does not collect the amount of tax that it would seem it could if its tax law was created in a way that is at least theoretically possible and deliverable. Let me explain the 5 components. 2 of these components actually exist before any tax is charged. They are inherent in the design of tax systems. In other words, the government does itself decide to undermine its own capacity to collect tax, which is something which, unfortunately, I think many tax justice campaigners are still not giving sufficient focus to. One example of a way in which a government undermines its own tax system is to decide not to simply tax a tax base. A tax base is a source of taxation revenue. For example, sales. In America, the USA, there is no value-added tax. There are some state sales taxes, but there is no value-added tax. That is a decision not to tax a tax base. In many countries, there are no wealth taxes. In some countries, for example, many tax havens, there are no taxes on company profits. These are decisions to undermine the tax system by not collecting a tax that could be due. That is the first stage of the tax gap. And tax justice campaigners need to ask, is that appropriate? Should we be charging these things to tax? And undoubtedly, some of these questions have been asked, for example, with regard to corporation tax, but insufficient, for example, with regard to wealth taxation and why it is not charged. So there is an area for attention. Second, the government, once it has decided to tax a source of income, for example, income from work or other sources of income, is then very often very generous in allowing people to offset, literally, tax allowances and tax reliefs against that source of income to reduce the amount on which they will pay tax. Now, some of those tax allowances appear entirely reasonable. There is a personal allowance, for example, in the UK, just over £12,500 a year at present, which means that that part of income is not subject to tax because it is assumed you need that much to live on before anybody has a right to tax you. And I'm not arguing with that, let's make that quite clear. But I am arguing, for example, that there is no particular reason why the UK provides enormous subsidies to pension saving in the UK, which go mainly to the wealthy. They cost something like £55 billion a year in the UK, very much more than is spent on many government programmes altogether. And I believe that that is something that appears to me to be inappropriate. So there is a lot of question to be asked about why government tax systems and why reliefs and allowances are structured as they are. Related to that, and also part of this tax gap, in my opinion, because it is about government expenditure, and these things are government expenditure, by the way, reducing an income stream is an expense, is the question as to whether a government appropriately funds its tax authority, or does it deliberately undermine its ability to collect tax by literally not providing it with the capacity to recover the tax that is owing. I fit that one into this second tax gap as well, and I have a very strong feeling that far too many in tax justice are ignoring this particular issue. To put it in context, something like £400 billion of tax reliefs and allowances are given in the UK in a year, and only a bit over £700 billion of tax is collected. So you can see that this tax gap is enormous in proportion to the amount of tax collected, and is indeed probably the biggest tax gap of all, and the government publishes very little information on what those allowances and reliefs are given for and why, and therefore it's a major target. The third part of the tax gap is tax evasion. Tax evasion is simply explained. It is the amount of money that is not paid in tax because a person has failed to declare a source of income or has explained allowances and reliefs to which they're not entitled. In other words, they've undertaken a criminal activity, and it's a job of the tax authority to find that, but of course if it's not funded to do so, this gap can be very big. I will compare it with the fourth tax gap, which is tax avoidance. Tax avoidance is the process of undermining the tax system by finding loopholes within it that provide outcomes which a legislator never intended. It is not using tax reliefs and allowances to claim an expense. That's part of the second tax gap, the one that the government intended, whether it was wise to or not. This is the one where people claim tax reliefs and allowances which the government did not intend. Now, that does include, for example, the activity of large companies shifting their profits legally, but nonetheless outside the spirit of the law, outside a country to a tax haven. And there are many other examples. Let's compare tax evasion and tax avoidance. Tax avoidance is largely done by the wealthy. Tax avoidance is often done by large companies. Tax evasion is much more commonplace. My evidence suggests that tax evasion might be 5 times larger than tax avoidance, and more tax avoidance might be done with regard to things like inheritance tax and capital gains tax than might be done with regard to income taxes. And yet, the tax justice movement, if you were to believe the balance of its campaigning, will put tax avoidance as a much more significant activity than tax evasion, and will put income taxes as a much bigger issue than the avoidance of taxes like those on capital. So the emphasis here is, again, I think, wrong. The tax justice movement needs to understand that tax evasion is the issue that they now really need to be tackling. I'm not saying tax avoidance isn't significant. It is, but a lot of work has been done, particularly around corporate tax avoidance and particularly around international tax abuse, which were the focuses of so much of the early work of the tax justice movement. And I was involved in creating that focus, so I'm not going to say it was wrong, but it was a focus. But I think we now need to move on and look at tax evasion and the domestic scene and why that is so important. Finally, there is a fifth tax gap, and that is, well, somebody declares a tax liability and then goes bust before they can pay it. That's bad debt. That is down to a government being efficient in collecting the tax owing to it and having good tax systems to do so before the time comes that the person can go bust. That's one that, frankly, I don't think needs much attention from tax justice, except to say, provide the tax authority with the resources it needs. Now, understanding this tax gap allows us to focus on what is important. And if I was to choose the priority, I would be looking, first of all, at the second tax gap, the one where the government gives away allowances and reliefs, because that is such a big issue and such a big cause of loss that campaigning around that is now fundamental. I would argue that tax evasion is much more important than tax avoidance because of the sheer quantum of the money involved and its the ability it has to create an unlevel playing field for people within a country, which I think is absolutely fundamental and which has been underplayed by tax justice to date, and which undermines business, which is why business should be the natural partners. Honest business should be the natural partners of such a campaign. And I would also be looking at the first of the tax gaps. Why don't we tax wealth, for example? Those issues seem to me to now be much more important than tax avoidance. Not because tax avoidance isn't significant, but because after 18 years of campaigning, we have done extraordinarily well to tackle tax avoidance. So let's think about where the focus should be now. And it's not on tax avoidance, it is elsewhere. But that requires us to understand the tax gap. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in what I've been saying in this video, please subscribe. There is a button below the viewing screen. If you're interested in what I have to say on Twitter, I'm at Richard J. Murphy on that medium. If you want to look at my blog, that's taxresearch.org.uk. And we have a Facebook page as well, Richard J. Murphy. So one of those things will get you more information on what this video series is about, and I hope I'll see you again soon.